So welcome to the Orchid Garden. My name is Andres. We are in the Monteverde Orchid Garden. It's basically one of the largest collections of wild orchid species in Costa Rica. We have almost 500 orchid species, which is basically about a third of all the Costa Rican orchids just found right here. A lot of these are natives and very different to each other, so I always like to show some examples, because these are orchids that can look very different and they're very easy to miss. As you can see right there. Now, most orchids in the world, about 80% are actually miniature orchids, flowers that grow not more than 3 centimeters or smaller. All these here are orchids that are adult orchids in full bloom, so all those are species right there. Orchids are really one of the largest families of plants around the world. There's over 30,000 species, and there are orchids even in Alaska and even in deserts too. Usually people think the orchid is only tropical, but that's a myth. And it's just that it's very hard to identify a lot of these orchids. And there are wild orchids, again, even in Alaska, even in deserts, but there's just species who, or that people know, but they just don't know them as orchids, because again, they can always look so different. Also, notice how most of them are growing on top of trees. And that's the majority of wild orchids. They are epiphytes or air plants. They grow on trees. They are not a parasite for the tree where they grow. So they're all collecting nutrients from just air, light, and rain around them. They have symbiosis with fungus around their roots, so they don't really need the living tree more than just for support. So this is a species that is known as the spider orchids. The genus is called Brassia, and there are many species around Costa Rica. So spider orchids in general are pollinated by these wasps right here, which are known as the tarantula wasp or tarantula hawks. Just something to explain really quick is that most orchids don't have nectar. A lot of orchids trick their pollinators. They offer them food or nectar, some other benefit, but then there's nothing in the end. The tarantula wasps, these are known to look for big spiders or tarantulas. They paralyze them to lay eggs in them. So it's a parasite wasp for the bigger spiders. Turns out that this wasp is, I guess, colorblind enough that they might get tricked into thinking that that's a spider. So when the wasp tries catching it, it just collects the pollen. And the wasp will realize it's a trick, but eventually just leaves, and so they do have short memory. The next week they'll get tricked again. So they keep coming back to this orchid and pollinating it, basically. So this right here, this is a orchid seed pod or fruit. So right after an orchid gets pollinated, the flowers or the petals drop and they start forming this seed pod. And all these powder you see right here, these are the seeds. So I'll just put some right here in my hand. And so the seeds are just like powder, so the wind can spread them. One of these seed pods could have millions of seeds, but it's less than 1% that germinate. And they are spread by wind, but they really need to land in the right spots to grow. Here in Costa Rica, we even have African orchids because of the trade winds bringing the seeds all the way here. But those seeds, again, less than 1% grow. They really need to land in the spot with the right light, humidity, temperature. They even need a fungus to help them kickstart the seed. And it's almost a fungus species per orchid species. It's really hard to grow them from seed. And that's why you always see in stores people are selling adult orchids. They never sell seeds because it's that hard to grow them. And speaking of the small seeds, then we also have the smallest orchid in the world right here. It's really, really tiny one. And so I'm gonna put the magnifying glass right there. So right there, it's about 1 millimeter or 2 in size. And I always emphasize that it's just the smallest orchid we know for now. So people keep discovering orchids every year. There could possibly be smaller than this. Alright, so this is basically one of the groups of orchids that most people know about, and it's the one you would see in stores all over the world. So the group is called the Phalaenopsis orchids or moth orchids. So there are wild ones in parts of Asia, but really all these Phalaenopsis that you see in stores around the world are hybrids, man-made orchid species. Basically made or enhanced to become commercial, a lot more showy, and they even last longer than most of the wild orchids. Wild orchids tend to bloom for just about a month or less once in the year. It's kind of like an average. These commercial orchids could bloom for 4 or 6 months, but again, they are hybridized to do that. So a good thing to know, again, there's 30,000 orchid species in the world. The Phalaenopsis group, I think, has about 60 species more or less. There are some smaller ones too, so I think it's maybe about 20 or 30 that are bigger. So those are the ones they use to make these hybrids. So it's important to know that in the end, out of the 30,000 orchids of the world, if you're looking for them in the wild, only about 20 or 30 Asian orchids look like this. Every other orchid really looks completely different. So this one here is called the black orchid, and it's Belize's national flower. Sadly, it's an endangered species of orchid because of people back there collecting a lot from the nature. This happens a lot in a lot of countries. So Costa Rica also has an orchid as the national flower, and it is endangered. Wouldn't amaze me if you could find more of Costa Rica's orchids in Belize, because you can find more of Belize's orchids in Costa Rica, and that's for the fact that people have collected so much of them. There are places where people protect orchids, reserves, and areas where people are actually collecting them to preserve them, to help them grow and spread seeds. But you always need a legal permit to collect an orchid from the wild. Some people don't have the legal permits, but they still want to preserve orchids. There are people I know who've even bought pieces of land just to protect that land so people don't go in to take the orchids. One of the problems here in Costa Rica is just the fact that sometimes people see it as too easy to just go out to the wild and pick an orchid. And it's something that comes even from culture from long times ago, and it is now known to be illegal to collect plants from the wild, but I guess most people don't realize why it could be, why it's illegal, and it's because you could really endanger a species. Apart from collecting too many, even if you think you're collecting an orchid from 5 meters away and the environment is the same and it would do fine, maybe you are putting that orchid just 5 centimeters far enough where the pollinator doesn't reach, so then the species never continues to spread seeds. So yeah, in the world there is a lot of endangered orchid species, and most cases it's because of people trying to collect them or pick them. Alright, this is a group of orchids that in general locals in Costa Rica call them golden rain orchids for the long stems, but they are also known commercially as the dancing ladies. And you can see the dress shape in the flower, the head, arms, the rest of the dress, and you can see it even for the red ones down here. There are many species of dancing ladies, and this one here has a sweet perfume. It smells almost like chocolate. Usually people don't realize a lot of orchids have perfumes, but in the wild they do. Lots of them have a perfume. Some smell only in the day, some only in the night. I even know orchids that smell only if it's raining, and it all depends on when the pollinator is active. It's pretty much a different insect that pollinates each kind of orchid, so that's why they have the different perfumes and colors and shapes too. Yeah, so this is the orchid garden in Monteverde, so thank you, and yeah, I hope you come to visit.